And today's colloquium is going to be delivered by Professor Hitoshi Murayama from the University of California, Berkeley. Before we introduce Professor Murayama, I'd like to say a few words about this special colloquium and about Helmut Baer himself. Helmut was born in China and attended a German missionary school. He then attended the University of Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And after that, he came to Michigan to a PhD program where he received his doctorate in 1967. During his stay here, he and Homer Neal shared an office in the Old West Physics building. And in introducing the inaugural Helmut Baer colloquium in 1996, Homer noted his great energy and infectious enthusiasm for physics. Helmut's PhD work was on the subject of gamma-ray spectroscopy under Mark Wiedenbach. He then moved to postdoc positions at the University of Michigan, Colorado, and Berkeley before joining the faculty of Case Western in 1974. In 1978, he went to join the staff at Los Alamos. At Los Alamos, he did research on pion physics and on the proton structure of nucleons. Helmut died in 1991 at the age of 52 after a short battle with cancer. This colloquium is made possible by gifts to the department, by the family and friends of Helmut. This is a special opportunity for the department to bring distinguished speakers here approximately every 2 years to celebrate advancements in physics and to honor the memory of Helmut Baer. We are all grateful to his family and friends, especially Joe Baer, and Joe may be listening on live stream, so a special thank you to Joe Baer and other members of the Baer family and friends in the department who have made this lecture series possible. I do want to note that Helmut Baer's grandson, Thomas Baer, is currently a graduate student here and is working at CERN. So now I'd like to invite Aaron Pierce up to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Hitoshi Murayama. Professor Murayama got his PhD at the University of Tokyo in 1991. A couple of years later, he came to this country where he was a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He was so great, they decided not to let him leave and then hired him as faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is still a faculty member today. In 2007, he became the founding director of the Kavli Institute for the Physics and Mathematics of the Universe at the University of Tokyo. Hitoshi has won a number of awards, including he's a fellow of the American Physical Society and has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You're in for a treat with this talk. He is a tireless promoter of science to the general public. His book on particle physics made it to near the top of the Japanese bestseller list. He was a panelist at the World Science Festival. He has one of these massive online courses on Coursera that over 100,000 people have registered for the Big Bang to dark energy. He also gave a speech to the UN headquarters on science for peace and development on the 60th anniversary of CERN. Hitoshi is also known for the incredible breadth of his research. He's an expert on topics ranging from neutrino physics to the hierarchy problem and understanding the physics of the electroweak scale. He's studied puzzles in cosmology, including the identity of the dark matter and the origin of the matter and the antimatter asymmetry that we observe in our universe. He's also studied a number of topics in quantum field theory with implications not just for particle physics, but also for condensed matter. Also recently, Hitoshi just finished serving as the chair for the P5, which is the Particle Physics Prioritization Panel. I'm not sure if that was enough P's. But project, okay, so project panel. Particle Physics Project Prioritization Panel. And this is sort of a decadal survey that sets the course for the future of particle physics. And so this is a huge responsibility, and I know that many of us in the field are very thankful for his work in that direction. He's also a fantastic mentor to his students and postdocs. He served for a PhD advisor for 7 people, now serving as faculty, including me. So I'd like to welcome Hitoshi to talk to us today about what happens when a symmetry breaks. So welcome, Professor Murayama.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so thank you for the invitation to give this prestigious Helmut Baer lecture. And I've been to University of Michigan many times by now. The last time I was here is when actually my son was doing thesis defense in math department here in Ann Arbor. So this was also an alum for the alma mater for him as well. And of course, I'm very proud of the fact that I was an advisor to Aaron Pierce, and also that his wife Chelsea used to babysit for us. So it's a very important connection here. So today I'm giving a rather unusual colloquium, I would say, with the title "When a Symmetry Breaks," where I talk about the very broad theoretical concept called spontaneous symmetry breaking. And the idea is that this is such an important concept in physics that unites the concept behind a piece of magnet on your fridge, cubes of ice, halibut, and rack of laundry. So that's what my talk is about. So before getting into the gist of it, I first would like to get started with the symmetry, which, as you all know, is a very central theme in physics for many, many years and even centuries. And we are all aware of this famous theorem proven by M.E. Noether, which says that symmetry is what actually gives us conservation law, like conservation of energies, angular momentum, and so on and so forth. And once you actually have conservation law, there's a conserved charge which actually ends up generating the symmetry. So they're really in one-to-one correspondence. And then pretty much all the discussions we do in physics are based on this important theorem. And for example, if you look at the universe, you see a spiral galaxy spinning this way, but you can also find a galaxy spinning the other way. So that's a demonstration that the laws of physics is invariant under mirror reflection. There are some exceptions to the rule called weak interactions, but nonetheless, by and large, physics is the same between left and right. I can't say that about politics, but anyway. And there's also a rotational symmetry you see in the universe, that you see galaxies with many different orientations. They all basically function the same. Therefore, laws of physics is invariant under rotation. And understanding the translational invariance are a bit more difficult, but this is actually a video made based on the real data taken by a project called Sloan Digital Sky Survey. They observed galaxies of particular shapes and colors. They basically put that into the computer so that you can pretend that you can do a fly-through in the universe today. And what you see here is, again, no matter how much you go, the universe looks pretty much the same. Hence, the translational invariance. Physics is invariant under pushing it to the left or right or front and back. So that's what we observe today. And of course, if you really would like to do this kind of flight through the universe, you have to travel at a speed which is 100 trillion times faster than the speed of light. So don't try this at home. But anyway, so we learn that laws of physics is translationally invariant. So when you look at the Newton's law of the equations of motion, you can see that you can do a reflection, you can do rotation, you can do translation, and F equal ma doesn't change. Hence, the laws of physics have the high degree of symmetry. But that actually poses an important question, that what we see around us doesn't seem to possess that high degree of symmetry. Many of us are right-handed. Most of us have a heart on the left-hand side of the body. So if the laws of physics is symmetric, what is the origin of diversity? And one answer to this question is this concept I wanted to talk about, namely spontaneous symmetry breaking. And for particle physicists like myself, a real hero is Yoichiro Nambu, who received a Nobel Prize based on this concept, namely that the symmetry is actually shared by a system, and let's say has a symmetry group of G, but its ground state respects only part of the symmetry. Then you have multiple ground states of the system which are totally degenerate in their energies, and that often also lead to a gapless excitations or massless particles depending on the field you study in. So that's the theorem. But the way I could describe it is by looking at the rack of laundry. So I still hang my laundry to let them dry to save carbon production. And when I hang the first shirt on this rack, it doesn't matter whether I hang it facing left or right. But imagine I hang the first shirt facing left. then when I come back with a second shirt to hang on the rack, I have the tendency to make them facing the same way to make it look neat. And all of a sudden, when I am finished hanging all these shirts and so on, and if I leave the room and come back in, I would say, oh my goodness, why is everything facing left? And it really didn't matter. They could have all faced right instead of left. But once I start doing this, that somehow the symmetry between left and right is spontaneously broken, and you end up finding one ground state where all the shirts are facing left. And same thing happens a lot in many circumstances in Mother Nature. So I mentioned halibut, and that is one of the flatfish where two eyes are on the left side of the body. And it's clear why they evolved in this way, because they would like to hide from the predators by actually sort of sitting on the seabed and inside the sand so that they can be totally hidden from the predators. But when they try to do this, they had an option of moving two eyes to the left-hand side of the body or to the right-hand side of the body. But halibut managed to choose them to be on the left-hand side of the body. And you can see that this really doesn't matter. It's just a random choice, because if you look at another kind of flatfish, namely flounder, they have two faces on the right-hand side of the body. And I can attest that they are different species of fish because I eat both of them and they taste differently. Halibut has kind of smooth taste and it's great for sushi. Flounder has a little bit of earthy aroma, so you'd like to actually simmer in sauce for a while. They are both delicious, but they're different species, and each species end up choosing on which side they would like to move two eyes on, and they are presumably written already in their genes, so they get inherited one generation after another. But again, to demonstrate the point that it really doesn't matter which way, this biologist, Reiko Kuroda in Japan, did the following experiment using conch. Again, conch is a kind of shellfish where shell sort of winds around in one particular way, not the other way. And to prove that this orientation really doesn't matter. So if you look at the way the egg of a conch hatches and then start to divide the cells, at the point when you have 4 cells, they start to wind in one particular direction before they eventually become an adult conch. But she did an experiment to nudge this divided 4 cells to start moving in the opposite direction by force. And she managed to let them grow to a completely healthy, perfectly okay adult conch at the end of the day. So it can wind around in both ways without any problems. And of course, the direction is already written in their genes, so even though this adult conch, which winds around in the opposite direction, their children would still wind around in the original direction. But nonetheless, this already shows the point that it really doesn't matter which way it goes. If you look at the piece of sugar, it also has this idea called chirality. So the kind of sugar we can consume is D-glucose with one particular orientation. And you can manufacture sugar with the opposite orientation, but we don't have an enzyme to digest that kind of sugar. And apparently, from what I read, among the entire biomass we have on this planet, only some very primitive bacteria can consume both orientation sugar, but the rest cannot. And all the plants also produce sugar of only one orientation over the other one. So entire system is relying on one particular orientation. So that's actually a great money-making opportunity for grad students here, because if you come up with a manufacturing method to produce this wrong orientation sugar, they taste the same way, but we can't digest them, so there's 0 calories. You see, you can be a billionaire, right? So, just remember, you heard it from me, not from somebody else. And same is true with amino acid. Again, entire life form on a planet is based on this left-handed one, not the right-handed one. And that's actually kind of interesting if you look for life form outside the planet. So recently, Japanese space probe went to visit one of these asteroids called Ryugu, which is like 40 minutes away with the speed of light from our planet, and took a sample and came back to the Earth. And when they showed this sand sample, people actually did discover some amino acid in the sand, and of course that raises a suspicion that there might have been also life elsewhere in a solar system. And there is a persistent actually theory that first of all, water, the entire water on a planet is believed to be brought by asteroids. So when the Earth was born, there was no water, so it came from an asteroid. And if that's the case, then maybe life also came from asteroids too. But if you actually analyze amino acids they have found in the sand from this asteroid, the two different orientations were 50-50. So that kind of proves the point that this is not part of any life system. It's presumably just a randomly produced amino acids by an accident. That's why it's 50-50 left and right. So knowing this idea of spontaneous symmetry breaking tells you something about life form outside the planet as well. And all of these examples are based on the single idea that you draw a potential energy like this, and this potential energy is symmetric and the interchange is left and right, and it doesn't change, and that's the symmetry. And so when you throw balls into this potential, well, it can bounce around several times and eventually drops to the minimum, but that minimum can be randomly chosen between left one and right one and 50-50 probabilities. So if you have only one system is forced to choose one minimum over the other. It doesn't matter which one, but it's forced to choose one out of the two, and hence symmetry is spontaneously broken. And the same thing can be said not on the discrete symmetry like this one, where you interchange left and right, but could be also on a continuous symmetry like rotational symmetry. And this is a picture I took from a write-up by Nobel Foundation. And when they wanted to explain this concept of spontaneous symmetry breaking, this is the example they came up with. Suppose you have sharpened a pencil to the extent that it's really sharp and it's pointed at a point. And if you manage to actually make it stand up, upside down, very, very carefully, so that it is totally symmetric under the rotation, then Newton's law of equations of motion tell you that it should stay standing. And of course, that doesn't happen in real life. If there's any little wind or if it touches a little bit, eventually it will fall down in one direction. But you can't tell which direction it falls down to. So once it fell, it is pointing to a particular direction, even though it could have pointed in any other directions on this table. So once again, system ends up choosing one ground state where symmetry is no longer visible because it has to choose one over many others. And another example Nobel Foundation came up with is a rod standing up. And if you exert force on this rod, at some point, this rod would buckle. And once again, it can buckle in all possible directions, but it has to choose one out of many. So in this case, continuous symmetry of being able to rotate the system by 360 degrees is now spontaneously broken because system ends up choosing one particular orientation over the others. And we see another example in magnet. So magnet is magnetized because it consists of many unpaired electrons in the system. And electrons get all oriented in the same direction once it cools down, and that's the idea of a ferromagnet. When the temperature is high, then all the spins are moving in random directions, so they are not oriented. But as you cool the system, if there's a force between the spins so that they would prefer to line up in the same direction, you end up finding all spins lined up in one orientation over another. Once again, it doesn't matter which way, but the system ends up choosing one orientation over all the other possible orientations. So in this case, system was originally invariant, is symmetric under all three-dimensional rotations, but in choosing one orientation over the others. The same thing would happen with ice cubes. When ice freezes to an ice cube, symmetry is broken too. So when I say frozen, I didn't mean this frozen, but what I meant was that when you start with a vapor where the water molecules are randomly moving around in a hot gas, once you cool the system, so that initially the molecules are moving in a random direction, but once the system is cooled and becomes a frozen ice, then ice is a crystal, so all the molecules are lined up neatly, which means that if you actually move the molecules in slightly to the side, that's a different crystal. It doesn't occupy the same place. If we rotate the crystal just a tiny bit, again, that's a different orientation of the crystal. That's not the same thing as what you started with. So here you see that translational symmetry and rotational symmetry of the system are spontaneously broken. And in quantum theories, there's something even more intricate that can happen. So when you think of the wave function, a macroscopic wave function of certain systems, like a superfluid helium-4, you have a symmetry to change the phase of overall wave function because, again, what matters is the absolute square of the wave function. That's the number density. And so the phase doesn't matter. And what happens in a superfluid is that it loses viscosity once the helium-4 is cooled down to below a critical temperature, to the extent that it can even climb up the wall and come dripping down from the vessel. And the reason why that happens is this symmetry of changing the phase of the wave function is frozen because the entire system is written in terms of this macroscopic wave function. And when you write down the wave function, you need to choose a particular phase for the wave function. And therefore, this phase symmetry, which corresponds to the conservation of number of atoms, is spontaneously broken. And you can even make this a local in a sense that you can change the phase of one wave function differently from one position to another. And that's what happens in a piece of superconductor. So in this case, the wave function refers to the pair of electrons called the Cooper pairs, and they become again condensed and described by macroscopic wave function. And then the phase also needs to be chosen in a particular way, and therefore symmetry is spontaneously broken. And in my home country, Japan, they are now building this magnetic levitation train, maglev. And the way they work is because the superconductor provides a very strong magnetic field. It can be levitate. That's why it doesn't shake very much when the train even goes at an incredible speed like a 300 miles an hour. And then also it can be driven forward by the force of the magnetic field. So superconductivity is very important for a practical application like this one too. Again, all of these examples is shown with a single concept that instead of this discrete symmetry between left and right, you now have a continuous symmetry, namely that if you draw a potential like this one, no matter how much you rotate, you still have the same potential. It has this axial symmetry. And that is written in terms of, again, simple mathematical formula. So x plus y squared is the distance from the origin, and when it's 1, it's at the minimum, and everything is invariant and rotating between x and y. So that's how we understand all of these systems based on a single equation like this potential. And we have learned a lot more recently, excuse me, because one force in nature, which I told you already that it doesn't respect parity, is called weak interaction. Oh, excuse me. Let me just calm down a little bit. Okay. So the force of weak interaction is something very important for us because this is the force that is actually important for the sun to burn and produce energy. So the nuclear fusion process is for powering the sun, as everybody here knows, but without for this weak interaction, it doesn't happen because it involves forces like neutrinos and so on and so forth. And people studied the nature of this weak interaction using this particle accelerator called LEP, or Large Electron-Positron Collider at CERN in Switzerland and France. And this is the same tunnel where the current Large Hadron Collider LHC experiment is in. But with previous version of the experiment LEP, people could study the nature of this weak interaction in great detail and found that this force is basically the same kind as the electromagnetism we are familiar with, following the Maxwell's equation. But for some reason, we know electromagnetism is a long-range force because if you hold a compass on your hand, your needle is being pulled by the North Pole of a planet. It goes over a wrong way, and that's how the electromagnetism works. Weak force is of the same kind, I said, but it can go only over as thousandths the size of the atomic nucleus, 10 to minus 16 centimeter. It's incredibly short range. And we don't know why, and that used to be the situation for many, many decades. But we learned something by looking at the other example of forces in nature, like superconductivity I mentioned earlier. And in what is called type 2 superconductor, magnetic field doesn't get into it more than, let's say, 100 microns or something, which is called penetration depth. And it can get in if it's squeezed into a tube of the magnetic field or a Brikosov flux, but otherwise it cannot get inside the superconductor. So what it means is that magnetism, even though it's a long-range force, has somehow become a short-range force inside a piece of superconductor. So we learned, looking at this example, and said, aha, maybe the whole universe is a piece of superconductor. We are dipped inside it. That's why what is supposed to be a long-range force of weak interaction looks like it is a short-range force, just like the way magnetism looks inside a superconductor. And that is the idea behind what is called the Higgs boson. So Higgs boson, just like the water vapor I mentioned earlier, was just flying in a completely random way when the universe was very hot. But at one point in the evolutionary universe became cold enough, and cold enough in this case maybe 1,000 trillion degrees, but anyway became cold enough that Higgs boson that was randomly moving in space eventually froze into empty space we live in. So we are living in the ice of Higgs boson, and that ice disturbs all the elementary particles except for the photon. And as we all know, photon interacts with anything that has an electric charge, but Higgs boson doesn't. So photon doesn't realize that it's moving in the ice of the Higgs boson. But all the other particles, including the particle that actually transmits the weak interaction called W boson, that's why it can't go very far, 10 to the minus 16 centimeter. In the case of electron, it interacts less. It gets disturbed less by this ice of the Higgs boson. It can go further, but still get slowed down from speed of light. And that's why it can stay happily inside a body, inside atoms. And if the amount of Higgs boson frozen in the universe was not right, namely if we had more of those, then weak interaction doesn't go anywhere, then sun wouldn't burn, and we can live in such a universe. On the other hand, if we have less of the Higgs boson in the universe today, weak interaction go very far, then the whole universe becomes radioactive. We wouldn't be able to live in that kind of universe either. Somehow, the amount of Higgs boson in the universe is just right. That's another major puzzle we don't understand yet at this moment. But anyway, this is the way we believe why weak interaction can go only over a certain distance, and electron gets slowed down with speed of light. So if for some reason that Higgs boson frozen in the universe today evaporates in an instant, what would happen is that electrons happily moving inside the atom will start moving the speed of light. It will totally disappear in an instant. And never mind that I'm so old that I have a picture with Einstein, for some reason in full resolution, in full color, never mind that. But the point here is that our bodies would also evaporate in a nanosecond. So this ice of the Higgs boson is what is keeping us in one piece. So our universe is filled with all these mavericks of Higgs boson somehow that we can stay in one piece. And we still don't know what exactly is this particle, why is it frozen in the universe today, and that of course has to do with the question, why do we exist at all? So it's kind of an important question. And this particle had been discovered about 10 years ago at Large Hadron Collider. So we know that exists frozen in the universe today, but we are still yet to learn a lot more about this particle. And one thing I'm really envious about the condensed matter physicists is that, as I talked about already, it's based on the same idea of superconductivity you can study in the laboratory. So if that's the case, there must be also Higgs boson in the superconductor, which had been experimentally shown. So the idea is that you have a piece of superconductor which has the same Hopf-Horn potential called Landau-Ginzburg potential. And this guy shown a powerful terawatt laser with a femtosecond pulse that would brought up the ground state sitting at the minimum of potential to somewhere up here. And then the system starts to go swish, swash, swish, swash. And that's the oscillation in radiation you see in this data. And that's the Higgs boson in superconductivity. So that's the way you can verify that same principle, same idea is really happening for the entire universe we live in and also a piece of superconductor. And going back to Helmut Baer, who actually studied nuclear physics, one of the exciting things happening in nuclear physics today is what is called the heavy ion collisions. And when you smash, in this case, lead ion against lead ion together at incredible speed, then you can observe that the protons and neutrons that make up nuclei would melt into a liquid of quarks and gluons, and then start to actually cool down and solidify and become a stream or bunch of particles called pions, which Helmut Baer studied in great detail. And the reason why you have so many pions coming up from a single collision is because this particle called a pion is light. And the reason why it's light is because it is associated with the spontaneous symmetry breaking, once again, of a symmetry called chiral symmetry, which appears in certain the quantum field theory. So broken symmetry appears pretty much everywhere when you look at the physical world. Very recently, I was very happy that I could at least understand how this chiral symmetry can be broken in the theory of strong interaction, which is very difficult to deal with because it's a strongly correlated system and you can work out things with the perturbation theory. But again, learning from what the atomic physicists showed us, namely that the BCS and BEC, so Bowden-Creeper-Schrieffer's theory of the superfluid and superconductivity and Bose-Einstein condensate are continuously connected from each other. So if you can study the weakly coupled theory of BCS, you can learn something about what's going to happen with the Bose-Einstein condensate with a strong coupling. In the same way, I could go from a system where I can analyze with a weak coupling and say something about the strong coupling limit where the chiral symmetry is indeed broken. So this is really happening. And when you have the continuous symmetry spontaneously broken, there's a famous theorem which you can find in any quantum field theory textbooks, often referred to as the Goldstone theorem. So what it says is that when a continuous symmetry is spontaneously broken, there appear the same number of massless particles or gapless excitations as the number of broken symmetries. And their dispersion relation is that the energy is linearly proportional to the momentum, and that's the theorem. And that seems to work indeed in many, many instances, and these massless particles or gapless excitations are collectively called number-Goldstone bosons. So again, let's look at the many examples to see if this is universally true. So I already told you the crystal spontaneously break translational symmetry. So I can't draw a three-dimensional crystal here. Let's say pretend that this is two-dimensional. Then you have a translation symmetry going this way or going that way. And crystal spontaneously broke both of these translational symmetries. So you have two broken symmetries. And lo and behold, if you push the system using one direction of translation, then the crystals start to vibrate. That's a sound wave or phonon, which is a gapless excitation, and energy is indeed proportional linearly to the momentum. And if you use the other direction of translation, this one here, then that will be the shear to the crystal, and the crystals start to vibrate once again. That's another form of transverse phonon, and again, energy is proportional to the momentum. So you do see two broken symmetries giving you two gapless excitations where both of them have the dispersion relation, energy is proportional to momentum. In the case of superfluidity, I mentioned this helium-4 superfluid. I told you that the macroscopic wave function has the symmetry of changing its phase, which is spontaneously broken once you have this macroscopic wave function. So you have one symmetry that's broken, and indeed you find one massless or gapless excitation that's also a phonon, where energy is proportional to the momentum. And helium-4 is rather strongly coupled and complicated. If you look at the simpler system of cold dilute gas of atoms, then you can see a much simpler spectrum. And once again, you see the dispersion relation is linear, energy goes proportional to the momentum. And we eventually hope to see the same thing happening even in the remnant of exploding stars called the supernovae. And once you have a supernova explosion, when a big star dies and it can't support its own weight, things start to collapse, and as a rebound, everything explodes. And that's what's believed to be a supernova explosion. And if you look at the core of supernova, we find pulsars. And you see, using X-ray, there's something pulsating indeed, and something is being blown out of this core of the star, namely neutron stars, which is an incredibly dense material, where basically the entire star becomes a nucleus. So the one solar mass can be contained in a few kilometer radius. It's an incredible star. And inside this star, it is again believed that the symmetry is spontaneously broken in a system analogous to BCS, a state of a superfluid of helium-3, and hopefully we get to actually observe that using, hopefully, in a gravitational wave detector in the future. So far it does seem to be working everywhere. But here is an example where it doesn't. If you think about a system of spins interacting with each other, I mentioned that the magnet on your fridge, and you can have two possible signs on the interaction, whether the spins prefer to be anti-parallel to each other, that's an antiferromagnet, or spins prefer to be parallel to each other, orienting in the same direction, that's the ferromagnet. And when the spins want to be anti-parallel to each other, you expect a ground state like this one. And of course, for ferromagnet, they want to be aligned in the same direction. So in both cases, you originally have the symmetry of rotating spins in an arbitrary way. So you have rotation left and right, you have rotation front and back, and you have rotation like this one. And so you have three symmetry in this system. But once they are lined up in this way along z direction, of course, this symmetry is still intact. You still do have the symmetry. But the other two, these and that one, is spontaneously broken. So that is given in mathematics, the coset space of SO3 equals SO2. It doesn't matter what the name is. But the point here is that the space of ground states forms a two-dimensional sphere corresponding to which way spins are oriented. So it's two-dimensional. But if you look at the number of gapless excitations, lo and behold, you do have 2 degrees of freedom corresponding to 2 broken symmetries for antiferromagnet. But for ferromagnet, there's actually only 1. So something is going wrong. And also looking at dispersion relation of these gapless excitations, for antiferromagnet, energy is linearly proportional to momentum. But for ferromagnet, energy goes like momentum squared. Something is wrong again. So what's going on? So just like what I pushed on crystal, I can also try to push the spins. And when you look at this ferromagnet, you would think that by pushing this system with this left to right rotation, you would expect this would be a gapless excitation. And if I push the spins in front and back symmetry, you would expect that this would be another gapless excitation. But we don't find them. The only excitation you can see in a ferromagnet is actually something like this. So it's spiraling in one particular direction, not the other way around. So there's something wrong with this Goldstone's theorem. And it turned out that this actually came out mostly from nuclear physics community, that people noticed that if you look at the many kind of models, if you work out the spectrum, you find abnormal number of Goldstone bosons. And this is about the supernovae, and that might lead to a condensation of kaon, that's yet another particle, and that will lead to abnormal number of Goldstone bosons. This is yet another system, abnormal number of Goldstone bosons. Now going back to the condensed matter physics spin systems, again, the abstract talks about the abnormal number of Goldstone modes. So it started getting recognized in literature that something is missing. And I was very happy to see there was even a paper by Nambu himself. So here he describes this basic idea that you're supposed to see the same number of broken symmetries as the number of gapless excitations. But here it says there are, however, exceptions to the above theorem. And Nambu passed away several years ago. It was kind of a big loss to the community, but I did happen to see him a couple of times before he passed away. And he was such a modest man. And even his student, I know, Marcus Ludi, who is now a faculty at UC Davis, didn't know how great man his advisor was. So he was so modest that he didn't brag about anything. So he was really known to be such a humble person. But I was happy to see, at least in this paper, he referred to these gapless excitations as Nambu goldstone bosons. So at least he was happy to use his own name on this. So I was really happy to see that. So as the people start to struggle with this question, what is actually missing? I wasn't very much aware of this issue when I was teaching a course on quantum field theory. But there was one student who is not my student, who was working for a condensed matter theorist in the department, kept asking lots of questions, and then became annoying to the point that I put him aside and started asking questions about, so what exactly is going on here? Then he told me, well, you talked about the Goldstone theorem in your lecture today, but it doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? Well, here's this example, here's that example. Look, it doesn't work. And that's when I realized that I didn't understand what's going on. Then we start to talk. And then eventually came to the realization that we were indeed missing something. And what we are missing is actually a very simple point. So if you look at the antiferromagnet, spins are all lined up in the opposite direction. So overall, there's no expectation value of the spin along the z direction. But in the case of ferromagnet, all the spins line up, and therefore they all add up. So there is a big expectation value of spin along the z direction. Now, we all learned in quantum mechanics class that spin along z direction can be written as a commutator of spin in x direction and spin in y direction. So if you stare at this commutator for a while, you eventually realize that this is kind of similar to canonical commutation relation, that x and p don't commute, but it's actually IH bar. So here, Sx and Sy don't commute to give you a number which corresponds to how much system is magnetized. So what that means is that when you kick the system using Sx for this rotation, or kick the system using Sy that corresponds to that rotation, they don't commute. They are canonical conjugate to each other. And just like x and p, if you have two observables that are canonical conjugate to each other, together they describe a single degree of freedom. So if you think of particle moving along the x direction, x is the position, p shows you how fast it's moving, and together you can describe a motion in the x direction, not individually. So if you have the commutator of two symmetries, which correspond to big expectation value here, they are canonical conjugate to each other. So this rotation and that rotation together describe 1 degree of freedom. And we could actually prove this on generality using the language of quantum field theory, never mind the details, but each of these pi's with the index A or B refer to a broken symmetry. So we introduce degrees of freedom for every broken symmetry in the system. But depending on the system, you may or may not have this first term. And if you do have this first term, pi dot has something pi in front of it. And that's the idea you see in the class of the analytical mechanics, which correspond to pq dot in the Lagrangian. So this pi and the rest are canonically conjugate to each other. But if you have a system where you don't have this first term, then pi dot is conjugate, pi is conjugate to pi dot. So each pi has both pi and pi dot so that it describes a single degree of freedom on its own. So whether you have this term or not makes a huge difference in terms of how many degrees of freedom you have in the system. So if two Navier-Goldstone fields, which is in this case, are canonical conjugate to each other, a pair of them describe a degree of freedom. So what matters a lot is looking at the expectation value of the commutator of the symmetries. And if they are paired, then you have to subtract 1 out of 2, because you're counting the number of pairs instead of number of symmetries. So the end result is that you have the number of Navier-Goldstone bosons or massless excitation, which is given by two of different types. Type A, we call, is the standalone ones. So each symmetry describes 1 degree of freedom. Type B is where a pair of the symmetries giving you 1 degree of freedom. So you have to subtract the number of pairs out of the total, which is half of the rank of this matrix. And that's the way we understand how many degrees of freedom exist in the system of your interest. And you can also see that when you don't have this term here, time derivative is energy in quantum mechanics. Spatial derivative is momentum in quantum mechanics. Here you see energy squared is balanced by momentum squared, and therefore energy goes like momentum. That's a linear dispersion relation. But if you have this term, this is proportional to energy that should balance momentum squared. So then you find a quadratic dispersion relation. Energy goes like momentum squared. So it turns out that this single line of equation tells you all systems on the same ground. And indeed, when we looked at all different kinds of systems that have been studied in the literature, no exception. In all these cases, the same formula applies. So we were very happy that we managed to publish this paper in PRL. It was chosen as the editor's suggestion. And so that's how we now have a generalized Goldstone's theorem that seems to work everywhere. And one very interesting system we found when we were studying it is called spinor Bose-Einstein condensate. And physics has become such a big community, so in some cases we have the language problem. When particle physicists say spinor, they always mean spin 1/2. When atomic physicists say spinor, it refers to any atoms with finite spin. And in many experiments, they are actually doing the alkali elements, so they have spin 1 in many cases. But anyway, so suppose you have an atom with spin 1. And if you have a Bose-Einstein condensate of such atom, then you have a symmetry of rotating spins. And when you have spin 1, the z direction can be +1, 0, -1. So you have 3 possible orientations. So you have the symmetry of rotating among 3 components. You also have this phase invariance corresponding to the conserved number of atoms in the system. So you have to talk about the order parameter, which is complex because it needs to have a phase, and in 3 components because you have 3 different spin orientations. And in the case of this kind of Bose-Einstein condensate, in some cases, it requires a very strange configuration of the expectation value, which actually ends up breaking this symmetry down to 2-dimensional rotation. And that's not obvious if you look at it, but if you actually separate the real part and imaginary part into 2 different columns, and then the phase rotation is the rotation between 2 columns, and the spatial rotation is a rotation among the 3 components. So if you separate the real part from the imaginary part, you see that you can undo spatial 2-dimensional rotation by doing a rotation between 2 column vectors. That's how you have this 2-dimensional rotation still left. So out of the original symmetries, which have 4 different symmetries, 3-dimensional rotation and phase, you are left with 1 symmetry, and therefore you have 3 broken symmetries. But there are only 2 gapless degrees of freedom. One of them has this linear relationship with energy, and one of them is quadratic. But now that we have seen the generalized theorem, you see that this is actually totally okay, because this one with quadratic dispersion corresponds to a pair of symmetries describing a single degree of freedom. So this needs to be counted twice. 2 + 1 is 3, which precisely corresponds to these 3 broken symmetries, and everything works out. And because the prediction is that energy should go with momentum squared for this mode of gapless excitation, we begged to my colleague, Dan Stamperkern in Berkeley Physics Department, who is the one who actually was running the lab under Kettley at MIT for the discovery of Bose-Einstein condensate. And he eventually agreed and decided to do the measurement that how energy goes with the momentum, and indeed it is quadratic. So it works. So this is the way, again, you can put all of these different systems on the same footing. And I don't elaborate on this, but once we actually start to understand what's going on, we need to have a language to describe them. And also talking to mathematicians in Berkeley math department, we eventually came to this language called pre-symplectic geometry. And again, I don't go into details, but it turns out to have a nice geometric structure that the part of the space of ground states are sort of like a phase space where you have pairs of Q and P. But part of the space of ground states is standalone, which doesn't have pairs. And your space of ground states is a mixture of the two, and that's something described by this rather esoteric mathematics called pre-symplectic geometry. And once you understand what is the correct mathematical language for it, then you can come up with the complete classifications on which case you are allowed for these pairs, and in which case you don't, and you can produce a big table of all possibilities which you can compare to the actual systems. And having learned how these things work, we recently proposed an idea that to detect one kind of dark matter candidate called axion, you may be able to use, again, a part of the phase diagram of the superfluid, but in this case, helium-3. And unlike helium-4, helium-3 nucleus is made of 2 protons and 1 neutron. Neutron is not paired, so the nucleus has a spin. In one of the phases called A1 phase of superfluid helium-3 becomes basically a nuclear ferromagnet. And one prediction of what this axion particle is supposed to do is to couple to nuclear spins very weakly, but it's supposed to couple to nuclear spin. So we propose that using this A1 phase of the nuclear ferromagnet made of the helium-3 could well be a way of detecting axion dark matter. And in principle, even for a kind of little size experiment, you can get down to the level of the predicted range in the coupling of axion to nuclear spins. So once you learn something, you can start actually developing new ideas based on that. And a couple of things I've been doing more lately, again, thinking about dark matter. So we know that there must be dark matter in our galaxy, in other galaxies, and in clusters of galaxies. And so we would like to understand what it is, because dark matter is again the reason why we exist. So we know from cosmic micro background, universe started out with very tiny variation in densities at the level 10 to the minus 5. Only thanks to the gravitational pull among dark matter particles, these tiny density fluctuations grew eventually to become order 1 and beyond, so that systems collapse down to form stars and galaxies, and hence us. So I tend to regard dark matter to be my mom, but I never met her, so we got separated by birth. So we'd like to see if we can ever going to see her. And one of the things which became an important discussion is that dark matter may be, we don't know yet, but maybe hitting each other inside the galaxies. It's called self-interacting dark matter. So most candidates people talked about dark matter are point-like objects, including the example of axion I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And another example which people are looking for very seriously is called WIMP, weakly interacting massive particles, that is also meant to be point-like particles. So inside a galaxy, they are moving about, but they basically never hit each other. But if this kind of indication is true, we need some kind of model of dark matter that has a finite size. And it turns out the data says the size of dark matter is as big as protons and neutrons. So that would be a strongly interacting system. So that's why we call this SIMP instead of WIMP. That stands for strongly interacting massive particles. So just like protons and neutrons, which are made of quarks and gluons, maybe dark matter is also made of dark quarks bound together by dark gluons. Maybe that's the dark matter. And it turns out that once you understand this notion of spontaneous symmetry breaking, you can work out how they should interact with each other. In the case of WIMPs, that's a standard theory of dark matter today called weakly interacting massive particles, that they are supposed to annihilate into standard model particles, and that would require sort of the weak scale coupling, like fine structure constant, and the weak scale mass around 300 GeV. That's why it has been subject to extensive search being done at the Large Hadron Collider. But once you take this point of view that dark matter may be these composite objects made of dark quarks and dark gluons, you can predict how they should interact with each other. And that is based on certain topological properties. And then they should undergo this 3-to-2 annihilation instead of 2-to-2 annihilation process. And you predict a very different range of coupling and mass. Namely, the coupling should be as strong as the strong interaction among protons and neutrons inside our nuclei. And mass also has to be on the similar scale of the nuclear physics, about 300 MeV. And it seems to work that way, and that's what we call SIMP miracle. And I'm involved in actually building an instrument for a major observatory called Symmetry telescope by having a 2400 robots that control the position of optical fiber cables, so that we can actually take the spectrum of 2400 stars in a given galaxy at the same time. And especially focusing on kind of galaxies which are really seem to be dominated by dark matter, we may be able to map out the mass distribution, which in turn tell us something about the nature of dark matter self-interaction among each other. It's a very complicated $100 million instrument. It's made of many different elements. This is the fiber positioner, which is moving to actually fix the position of the fiber optical cable, pointing at a particular star you'd like to observe. You need to bundle the fiber optic cables into tubes so that they would be not getting a sort of big tensions to actually make the internal reflection not possible. Many other optical elements there. But this survey is beginning, we hope to start actually next semester in the spring semester 25. So we are very excited that we gain something more on the nature of dark matter fairly soon. And last subject I'd like to talk about is yet another existential issue with human beings. So we know the universe started with the Big Bang, and there was a huge amount of energy there. And we know energy can turn into matter, but only together with antimatter. So when you send a photon, it can create electron, but always together with a positron. So when energy is converted to matter, and you have matter and antimatter, always in 1-to-1 ratio. So let's say the universe started with, say, billion matter particles and a billion antimatter particles produced together. But if it stayed that way, as the universe expands and cools, matter and antimatter would meet. They also annihilate 1-to-1, then all of them get lost. So we had a fate of facing a complete annihilation. Somehow, we evaded the fate. The only way we could have evaded such a fate is that somehow, at some point, somebody picked up one antimatter out of a billion and turned that into matter. And only if that were possible, as much of the matter and antimatter annihilate with each other at the end of the day, there is the difference of 2 that is supposed to be us. So first of all, we should be very grateful to the billion friends we lost on its way. But we should be even more grateful to somebody who managed to reshuffle the amount of matter and antimatter. Who could that be? And one of the best promising theory we have today is that the guy in charge to have done this is neutrinos. And that idea is called leptogenesis. And the reason is actually very simple. If you think of matter particle of electric charge Q, antimatter has electric charge negative Q. Electron has charge -1, positron has charge +1. We know electrical charges is a conserved quantity. It's a conservation law of electric charges. So the particle of charge Q can never turn into charged particle of charge -Q, except when Q is 0. So if you have a matter particle with charge 0, its antimatter counterpart would have charge -0, which is the same thing as 0. So they may possibly turn into each other. We haven't seen this process so far, and I know people in the department is looking for such a possibility by observing neutron level beta decay. But the point here is that the only candidate we have among the matter particles on the list of elementary particles is neutrinos, which doesn't have electric charge, therefore could have reshuffled matter and antimatter at some point in the early universe. So if that's the case, we really owe our existence to neutrinos. This theory had been written by Fukugira and Inagita, where at the Calvin Institute, I found it, as Aaron mentioned earlier. So if this is true, the neutrinos saved us from complete annihilation, so we should be really thankful to them. And I'm not actually very good at editing graphics, so I spent hours changing I to nu here in this emblem. But anyway, so in the end, I succeeded, I think. So if this is the right idea, we need new kind of neutrinos. So we know all neutrinos we have observed to date are left-handed. It's spinning counterclockwise as the neutrinos move. But in order to generate mass to them, and so that they can reshuffle matter to antimatter, we need also the right-handed counterpart. And for this theory to work, the right-handed neutrino must be very, very heavy, which ranges from like 10 to the 10th GeV to 10 to the 15 GeV. Remember, the mass of the proton is 1 GeV. So we're talking about 10 to 15 order of magnitude higher masses for an elementary particle, which is amazingly heavy particle. So if you want to test this idea, first thing to think about is to produce this 10 to the 14 GeV particle. And using the current technology of building such a machine, this is going to be as big as a galaxy. That obviously will require international interagency collaborations, presumably even interplanetary collaboration. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. So we have to think about other ways. But this will definitely be an ultimate future circular collider. So the idea I came up with is that, okay, so once again, we need to have a mechanism of generating mass, like what we have seen with the Higgs boson and superconductivity. So if we want to generate this mass of this right-handed counterpart of neutrinos, presumably there's also yet another phase transition that breaks symmetry. And if that happens in a way that superconductivity works, then that could also squeeze magnetic field in a way that gets trapped inside the universe. So in a similar way that superconductor in a laboratory can trap magnetic field in tubes, when phase transition happens in the early universe, it can trap magnetic field in a random orientation in the whole universe, and that is the idea called cosmic strings. So each of the strings is a tube of magnetic field, and as the universe expands, the network starts to simplify in a rather complicated fashion, but as they keep simplifying it, then it can actually emit gravitational waves, which of course had been detected from the black hole mergers rather recently. So this would be a stochastic gravitational wave coming from early universe. And an interesting thing about this is that normally, if you like to probe physics at very high energy scales, it becomes more and more difficult as the energy goes up. But for the exception of gravitational wave, the higher the energy is, the bigger the signal. So we are talking about this incredibly high energies of 10 to the 10 to 10 to 15 GeV, but in some sense that's high enough so that you can expect decent signal in gravitational waves, so that depending on energy scales, these experiments, which may happen in the future, have an opportunity to actually dig down in the parameter space and possibly observe gravitational waves coming from superconductivity happening at this incredible energy scale due to the spontaneous symmetry breaking. So my talk was trying to tie together all these different phenomena, but based on a single concept, which I managed to generalize to be applicable to all of these systems on the same footing. And the way this simple idea can explain so many different phenomena we can observe is the reason why I find physics is a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, thanks to Hitoshi for a great talk. So we can take some questions. I think we have a couple of students who will take you a microphone in case you have a question so everyone can hear it.
Yeah, please ask any questions you might have.
So if there's anyone who has a question.
Oh no, silence is usually a bad.
thanks so much. I had a question about the right-handed neutrinos.
Okay.
At that masses, wouldn't that have a pretty perceptible effect on like temperature evolution of the universe?
Excuse me?
At the masses of this kind of right-handed neutrino, wouldn't that have like an impact on the temperature evolution of the universe that we would be able to perceive?
At the very early stages, yes. So these particles must have been produced basically just when the thermal interaction, when the temperature was as high as this kind of mass scale, and they are produced. And eventually, they are unstable particles. They decay, and when they decay, at the first order approximation, they decay 50-50 into matter and antimatter. But if you include the quantum effects to that decay, and based on very simple ideas, it can create imbalance between the probability of decay into matter particles versus antimatter particles. And that's something we have actually observed experimentally in a neutral kaon system called epsilon prime, and also in B systems as well. So these things are known to happen in nature. It's just that if this happens also to the right-handed neutrinos, it can create this imbalance between matter and antimatter when they decay, and that gets eventually converted to the difference between the nucleons we are made of versus not having anti-nucleons in the universe today.
Other questions?
Gordy.
At the beginning, you mentioned the mass of the Higgs boson as crucial.
Yeah, it needs to be just right.
Does this give you any insight into that mass, the chain of arguments here?
Certainly, as you know better than I do, the people did worry about this question. Why does the Higgs boson have the right number density in the universe today? Why does it have the mass it does today? And we don't have a good answer to that yet. And you worked on this idea called supersymmetry a lot to explain that question. And I have been also actively working in that area too. So far we have not seen experimental evidence of it, but it may be just happens to be a little bit delayed in terms of we have to go to slightly higher energy. So we need to see. So that's at least the hope I have that we will eventually will understand the answer to this question.
More questions?
No questions is typical sign of bad talk, so I'm worried about this.
You have a question? Yes.
Yeah, so when you were talking about this pair of symmetries,
Uh-huh.
the only thing that tells us that the two symmetries are paired are the commutator of them, or if you have some other types of algebra?
No, that's the only way you can have this pairing between two different symmetries. So whenever you have this pairing going on, the commutator of two symmetries should have an expectation value of something in a way that the XP commutator has a value of IH bar. So only when that happens, you can actually prove, based on this simple field theory equation, that commutator would precisely correspond to the first term in the equation I wrote with the first order in time derivative. And there's a one-to-one correspondence. And once you see that, and when you quantize it, you see the number of degrees of freedom to be halved. So they're all together in the same way, and you can prove that that's the way it works. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Any more? If not, let's thank Hitoshi.